Dr. Valkera had seen thousands of species in her 3 centuries of practicing xenomedicine across the galactic concordat, but nothing had prepared her for the absurdity that was human biology. She stood in the sterile white examination room of the CSS Endeavour, her 4 crystalline eyes reflecting the dim bioluminescence that pulsed rhythmically beneath her translucent skin, and she could barely contain her amusement. The human before her, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, sat on the examination platform with an expression that suggested he'd heard this reaction before. Valkera's translator implant rendered her chittering laughter into something approximating mirth as she reviewed his preliminary scans, each reading more preposterous than the last. "Forgive me, Commander," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality of her Thetian heritage, though it was tinged with barely concealed condescension. "But your species' evolutionary path is, well, it's remarkably inefficient." She gestured with one of her 6 slender appendages toward the holographic display floating between them, where Marcus's skeletal structure rotated slowly in 3 dimensions. "You have a spine made of individual segments that can slip out of alignment. Your primary sensory organs are filled with fluid that sloshes about. You require constant hydration, yet your body expels water through your skin for temperature regulation, a process so wasteful that my colleagues in the xenobiology department used it as an example of evolutionary dead ends." Marcus shifted slightly, the examination platform creaking under his weight, another factor that Valkera found amusing. Humans were dense, their bodies packed with redundant systems and inefficient organs, carrying mass that served no apparent purpose in the age of advanced technology. "We've managed to get this far, Doctor," he replied, his tone diplomatic but carrying an edge that Valkera's finely tuned emotional sensors detected immediately. "Pride. How quaint." "Oh, undoubtedly," Valkera continued, warming to her subject as she often did when presented with particularly fascinating cases of biological mediocrity. "Your species has shown remarkable adaptability in spite of your limitations. But from a pure physiological standpoint, humans are fragile. Your healing factor is adequate but slow. Your immune system is reactive rather than predictive. Your bones are dense but brittle compared to carbon silicate matrices. And don't even begin to discuss your reproductive cycle, so inefficient that it's a wonder your species propagated at all." She paused, mandibles clicking in what her species considered a warm smile, though she knew humans found the expression unsettling. The Concordat Medical Database lists humans as a Category 7 species, physiologically speaking. That places you just above the quilphin, whose primary defense mechanism is reproducing so quickly that predators cannot eat them fast enough to cause extinction. Marcus's jaw tightened, a micro-expression that Valkera's training helped her recognize as suppressed anger. Good. Emotional engagement meant he was listening, and despite her clinical assessment of his species' shortcomings, Valkera did take her duties seriously. "The battery of tests we're running today is standard protocol for all Concordat military personnel operating in deep space," she continued, her tone becoming slightly more professional as she manipulated the holographic interface, pulling up a series of diagnostic protocols. "Given your species' relative fragility, I've included additional stress tests, cellular degradation analysis, and psychological resilience markers. Humans have a documented tendency toward what we call biological optimism, your body's continuing to function even when logic suggests they should shut down, but we need baseline data to understand your operational parameters. How long will the results take?" Marcus asked, and Valkera detected something in his voice that she couldn't quite classify. "Not fear, not exactly. Anticipation, perhaps." 72 standard hours, she replied, already moving toward the door, her interest in the conversation waning now that the preliminary examination was complete. "I'll have my assistant compile the data. Try not to injure yourself in the interim, Commander. I understand your kind enjoys what you call exercise, but given your skeletal structure's propensity for failure, I'd recommend sedentary activities." She didn't wait for his response, her form gliding through the automatic doors with the effortless grace of a species that had evolved in low gravity, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and what she assumed was his wounded pride. As she made her way back to her laboratory, Valkera allowed herself a moment of satisfied superiority. In her centuries of practice, she'd encountered species that could regenerate entire limbs, organisms that could survive in the vacuum of space without protection, beings whose very cellular structure was resistant to radiation that would liquefy human tissue in seconds. Humans, for all their noise and bluster in the Concordat, for all their recent technological achievements and their surprising tactical victories in border skirmishes, were biologically unremarkable. Fascinating in their inefficiency, certainly, worth studying as an example of evolutionary persistence despite obvious design flaws, but unremarkable nonetheless. The tests she'd ordered were thorough, perhaps more thorough than strictly necessary, but Valkera prided herself on comprehensive data collection. When the results came back, she would have a complete picture of human limitations, valuable information for the Concordat military command as they integrated more of these enthusiastic but fragile beings into their forces. The first anomaly appeared 36 hours into the analysis, a small discrepancy in Marcus's cellular regeneration rates that Valkera initially dismissed as a calibration error in her equipment. Her laboratory, a marvel of Concordat technology that occupied an entire deck of the CSS Endeavour, hummed with the soft vibration of quantum processors analyzing the petabytes of data collected from the human's examination. Valkera stood before a wall of holographic displays, her multiple eyes tracking different data streams simultaneously, a capability that had made her one of the Concordat's premier xenomedicine specialists. The regeneration rate flickered again, the numbers climbing beyond what the Concordat database listed as human normal, and she felt the first stirring of something she rarely experienced in her profession, uncertainty. System, run diagnostic protocol VEL-79 on all cellular analysis equipment, she commanded, her voice sharp in the empty laboratory. She worked alone by preference, finding the presence of assistants distracting, and now she was grateful for the privacy as she tried to understand what her instruments were telling her. The diagnostic completed in seconds, all systems functioning within optimal parameters, which meant the readings were accurate. Valkera's skin flickered through a spectrum of colors, an involuntary response to confusion that she quickly suppressed. Humans didn't heal this fast. The database was clear on that point, compiled from thousands of samples across hundreds of colony worlds. Yet here was Marcus Webb's data, showing cellular regeneration occurring at nearly 3 times the documented rate. She pulled up comparative analysis, overlaying Marcus's results with the median human baseline, and the divergence was undeniable. His mitochondrial efficiency was operating at levels that should be impossible for a species that relied on such primitive metabolic processes. The muscle tissue density suggested adaptation to gravity well significantly stronger than Earth Standard 1.0, yet his service record showed he'd spent most of his adult life in standard Concordat environments. Most puzzling was the presence of what appeared to be dormant genetic sequences, sections of his DNA that weren't expressing but carried the markers of extreme environmental adaptation, coded instructions for biological responses to conditions that Valkera couldn't even classify. Impossible, she muttered, though the word felt hollow even as she spoke it. The data didn't lie, and her equipment was the finest the Concordat could produce, calibrated to analyze species ranging from methane breathers to crystalline collective consciousnesses. She initiated deeper scans, pulling archived data from the preliminary tests, cross-referencing everything against the comprehensive xenobiology databases that represented the collected knowledge of 400 member species spanning 12,000 worlds. Humans were listed, their biology documented extensively from the 50 years since first contact, but nothing in those records suggested what she was seeing now. The stress response markers were equally baffling. When subjected to simulated extreme conditions in the testing protocols, Marcus's body had responded with a cascade of biological reactions that Valkera had initially classified as panic responses, the thrashing of an inferior organism facing circumstances beyond its capacity to handle. But the detailed analysis revealed something far more sophisticated. His body was adapting in real time, producing specific enzymes and hormones that optimized performance under pressure, rerouting blood flow with precision that suggested active intelligence at the cellular level, not the crude autonomic responses documented in human medical literature. Valkera spent the next 12 hours in her laboratory, refusing meals and ignoring the soft chimes that indicated messages from colleagues and subordinates. She ran the tests again, then again, each iteration confirming what she was increasingly unable to deny. Either her equipment was experiencing a systematic failure across multiple redundant systems, an unlikelihood that bordered on the impossible, or the human baseline data in the Concordat archives was catastrophically incomplete. Neither option was acceptable. Her reputation rested on precision and accuracy, and the thought that she had publicly mocked a species based on faulty information sent waves of chromatic distress across her skin. The psychological resilience data was perhaps the most disturbing discovery. Velkera had included standard trauma response protocols in her testing, expecting to find the typical markers of a species still adapting to the realities of deep space and interspecies conflict. What she found instead was a psychological architecture that her analytical framework struggled to categorize. Marcus's neural patterns under stress showed simultaneous activation of fear responses and executive function, his brain literally operating in contradictory modes that should have paralyzed decision-making but instead appeared to enhance it. The Concordat databases called this courage when they bothered to mention it at all, treating it as a quaint cultural characteristic rather than a measurable biological phenomenon, but the data suggested it was hardwired into human neurology at a fundamental level. She pulled up Marcus's service record, reading it with new eyes, suddenly seeing patterns she'd dismissed before. Multiple commendations for action under fire. A notation about refusing medical evacuation during a ship-to-ship engagement until his station was properly relieved. An incident report from a training exercise where he'd continued operating for 6 hours on a fractured leg, believing the exercise parameters required it. Velkera had skimmed these details during her initial review, categorizing them as the kind of reckless behavior one expected from a Category 7 species, but now they read like data points in a larger pattern she was only beginning to comprehend. Computer, show me all recorded instances of human combat performance across Concordat military engagements, she commanded, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her thorax. The holographic displays shifted, filling with after-action reports, medical data from battlefield triage, and performance metrics from conflicts across the Concordat's border regions. Velkera began to read, her multiple eyes moving rapidly across the streams of information, and with each report, each statistical analysis, each recorded instance of humans operating beyond their supposed physiological limits, the careful edifice of her certainty began to crumble. By the time the 72-hour analysis window closed, Velkera had not slept, a dangerous state for a Thesian whose biology required regular rest cycles to maintain cognitive function, but she found herself unable to step away from the mounting evidence that everything she thought she understood about human biology was merely the surface of something far more complex. The complete results from Marcus Webb's examination filled her laboratory displays in cascading columns of data, each metric more remarkable than the last, and she stood in the center of it all feeling something she had not experienced in decades of medical practice, genuine awe mixed with a creeping sense of dread. The cardiovascular system analysis had revealed an organ that was less a pump and more an adaptive performance engine, capable of varying its output across a range that would kill most species through sheer mechanical stress. Marcus's heart could slow to a near meditative state during rest, conserving energy with remarkable efficiency, then spike to rates that pushed oxygenated blood through his system with such force that it temporarily enhanced cognitive and physical performance beyond his normal baselines. The vessel walls showed elasticity that allowed for this variation, a biological engineering that the Concordat's finest medical technologies struggled to replicate in artificial organs. And this was in a species that considered heart failure one of their leading causes of death, a fact that now seemed less like a design flaw and more like the price of operating such a sophisticated system at the edge of its capacity for an entire lifetime. The neurological data was even more fascinating and troubling. Velkera had expected to find a brain that was adequate for tool use and basic reasoning, perhaps with some enhanced social processing to account for humanity's tribal nature, but what the deep scans revealed was an organ of staggering complexity and redundancy. Marcus's brain showed evidence of multiple parallel processing pathways, regions that could assume functions of damaged areas, a plasticity that allowed for continuous adaptation and learning even in his adult state when most species' neural development had long since crystallized into fixed patterns. More remarkably, the stress testing had revealed what human researchers apparently called the fight-or-flight response, but which the detailed analysis showed was actually a complete systemic override protocol, flooding the body with performance-enhancing compounds while simultaneously sharpening sensory processing and accelerating decision-making speeds. She had pulled archived combat footage from the Concordat military databases, watching with new understanding as human soldiers operated in conditions that should have reduced them to panic or paralysis. There, in a grainy recording from the Kelvin border incident, she watched a human squad hold a defensive position for 14 hours against a numerically superior force, their bodies moving with an efficiency that her analysis now told her was chemically enhanced by their own biology, their brains making tactical decisions while simultaneously processing fear and pain, compartmentalizing trauma in real time to maintain operational effectiveness. What she had previously understood as recklessness or ignorance of danger, she now recognized as a species-wide biological capability to acknowledge threats while refusing to be controlled by them. The immune system analysis had forced her to recalibrate her understanding of defensive medicine entirely. Human immune responses were not merely reactive as the Concordat databases suggested, they were adaptive learning systems that retained information about threats and built specific countermeasures, sometimes within days of exposure. Marcus's blood work showed antibodies for pathogens he'd never been vaccinated against, his body having encountered and defeated them during his service across multiple worlds, each victory encoded in his cellular memory. The system was aggressive to the point of occasionally attacking its own host, a flaw that humans called autoimmune disease, but Velcara now understood as the price of maintaining a defense network so robust that it treated anything unrecognized as a potential threat requiring immediate and overwhelming response. Most troubling of all was the data on human cellular senescence and damage repair. The Concordat medical literature described human aging as a steady degradation, a species whose cellular repair mechanisms were adequate but unremarkable, leading to a lifespan that was brief by Concordat standards. But the deep genetic analysis of Marcus's cells revealed something that the summary data had completely missed. Human DNA carried extensive error correction codes and repair protocols, damage response mechanisms that were continuously active, fighting a constant war against cellular breakdown. The telomeres that capped their chromosomes and limited their lifespan appeared to be not a design flaw but a deliberate limitation, a biological safeguard against the same cellular multiplication that became cancer when those safeguards failed. Velcara pulled up the comparative mortality data, examining human death rates across different categories, and a pattern emerged that sent a chill through her crystalline structure. Humans didn't die because their bodies were weak, they died because their bodies were so aggressive, so relentlessly optimized for survival and performance, that they burned themselves out. Their hearts failed because they'd spent lifetimes operating at capacities that would be considered emergency overload in other species. Their immune systems sometimes attacked their own tissue because the threat detection parameters were set to maximum sensitivity. They developed cancers because their cellular multiplication protocols were optimized for rapid healing and adaptation, and sometimes those protocols escaped the limiting safeguards. They were not a fragile species stumbling through evolution by luck, they were a species whose biology was so intensely, relentlessly vital that it consumed itself. She thought of her dismissive comments to Marcus, her casual mockery of his inefficient design, and felt a wash of something that her translator would have struggled to render into human language but which approximated to profound embarrassment. She had looked at human biology through the lens of Concordat norms, species that had evolved in stable environments with predictable challenges, whose biology reflected the refined efficiency of optimized systems. But humans had evolved on a death world, a planet whose climate swung between extremes, whose predators were numerous and deadly, whose very atmosphere had once been toxic until life itself had transformed it, and their biology reflected not optimization for stability but for survival under any circumstances whatsoever. The complete picture began to assemble in her mind, data points connecting into a comprehensive understanding that fundamentally challenged the Concordat's classification system. Velkera stood before the completed analysis, her laboratory dimmed to minimal lighting as she processed the implications of what she had discovered, and for the first time in her long career, she felt the weight of genuine uncertainty about how to proceed. The data. Humanity was not a Category 7 species stumbling into the galactic community through technological achievement and stubborn persistence, but something the Concordat had never encountered before, a species whose very biological foundation was built on principles that challenged assumptions about evolutionary optimization. She initiated a deep archive search, pulling medical data from every human colony world, every ship with human crew, every military engagement where human personnel had been involved, and the patterns emerged with statistical certainty that erased any possibility of Marcus Webb being an outlier. Across every dataset, humans consistently operated beyond their documented baselines under stress, their bodies responding to danger and challenge with systematic enhancement protocols that seemed to trigger automatically. The medical literature called it adrenaline response and dismissed it as a crude evolutionary holdover, but the comprehensive analysis revealed it as a sophisticated performance optimization system that could be triggered by everything from physical threat to intellectual challenge to emotional extremity. She found documented cases of human mothers lifting vehicles to free trapped children, feats of strength that should have torn their muscles from bone but which they accomplished through what the reports called hysterical strength, a dismissive term for what was clearly an emergency override protocol that temporarily removed the safety limiters on human muscular force. She found combat records of humans continuing to fight with injuries that should have rendered them unconscious from pain, their bodies flooding their systems with endogenous analgesics while maintaining consciousness and tactical awareness. She found survival accounts from disaster scenarios where humans had functioned for days without food or water, their metabolic processes shifting into conservation modes that allowed them to operate on minimal resources while maintaining decision-making capacity. The psychological data was perhaps the most alien aspect from a Concordat perspective, because it revealed that human neurology didn't just allow them to function despite fear and pain. It actually utilized those signals as performance data, incorporating threat assessment into decision-making while refusing to allow it to paralyze action. Velkera found studies on human risk assessment that showed they were capable of simultaneously acknowledging the probability of death while choosing to proceed anyway, not from ignorance but from a conscious decision that some objectives outweighed personal survival. The Concordat psychological frameworks classified this as aberrant behavior, a failure of rational self-interest, but the military performance data showed it was a consistent species-wide trait that made humans extraordinarily effective in roles that required personal sacrifice for collective benefit. She pulled up the data on human healing rates again, examining the detailed cellular analysis with new understanding. What she had initially seen as slow and inefficient was actually a carefully balanced process that prioritized functional recovery over speed, rebuilding damaged tissue with remarkable fidelity to the original structure rather than simply closing wounds with scar tissue. The process could be accelerated under stress, the body trading long-term optimal healing for short-term functional recovery when circumstances demanded it, another example of the adaptive flexibility that characterized human biology at every level. And the pain signals that accompanied healing, which Velkera had thought of as an unfortunate side effect of a crude system, were actually detailed damage reports that allowed humans to protect injuries while remaining mobile and functional, a sophisticated biofeedback mechanism that kept them operational even while compromised. The reproductive data that she had mocked for its inefficiency revealed itself as another example of the fundamental difference between human biology and Concordat norms. Where most species optimized for either high-quantity offspring with minimal investment or low-quantity offspring with extended development, humans had evolved a middle path that produced relatively few offspring but invested enormous resources in their development both before and after birth, creating an extended childhood that allowed for massive neural development and cultural knowledge transfer. The inefficiency wasn't a flaw. It was an investment strategy that prioritized adaptability and learning capacity over rapid population expansion, producing individuals who could thrive in novel environments through intelligence and social cooperation rather than relying on hardwired instinctual behaviors. Velkera initiated a simulation, feeding the comprehensive human biological data into the Concordat's evolutionary modeling systems, asking it to predict what kind of environment would produce such a species, and the results were sobering. The models suggested Earth was significantly more hostile than the initial Concordat surveys had indicated, with selection pressures that consistently favored not specialized adaptations but generalized resilience, not optimization for specific threats but flexibility to handle unpredictable challenges. The simulation suggested that human evolution had occurred in an environment where the threats were so varied and the conditions so unstable that the only successful strategy was to develop biological systems that could adapt to almost anything, even if that meant accepting reduced efficiency in stable conditions. She thought about the casual conversation she'd had with Marcus, her amused superiority as she'd catalogued his species' supposed flaws, and now each of those flaws revealed itself as a feature of a biology that prioritized survival under adverse conditions over optimal function in ideal ones. The spine that could slip out of alignment was also flexible enough to allow for a range of motion that many species couldn't match, enabling humans to climb, swim, run, and fight with equal facility. The fluid-filled sensory organs that sloshed about also provided sophisticated three-dimensional balance and acceleration sensing that made humans remarkably agile. The constant need for hydration was the price of a cooling system that allowed them to maintain peak performance in temperature ranges that would force other species into dormancy. Marcus Webb arrived at Valcara's laboratory precisely on time for the results consultation, his service uniform crisp and his expression carefully neutral, and she knew from her study of human microexpressions that he was preparing himself for another session of clinical mockery from the alien doctor who found his species amusing. The knowledge of what she'd said to him, viewed through the lens of what she now understood about human biology and psychology, filled her with something that her species' emotional taxonomy categorized as profound regret. She gestured for him to sit, noting the controlled grace of his movement, understanding now that the apparent simplicity of human locomotion concealed a sophisticated balance between dozens of muscle groups and real-time neurological adjustments that allowed them to move efficiently across varied terrain without conscious thought. "Commander Webb," she began, her voice carefully modulated to convey the seriousness of what she needed to say, "I owe you an apology." The statement clearly surprised him. She could see the micro-reactions in his facial muscles, the slight widening of his eyes, the fractional shift in his posture. "My initial assessment of human biology was based on incomplete data and flawed assumptions. The comprehensive analysis of your test results has revealed that the Concordat's understanding of your species is fundamentally inadequate." She activated the holographic displays, filling the space between them with cascading data, but she didn't hide behind the numbers this time. "When I examined you 72 hours ago, I saw what I expected to see, a species that had achieved technological sophistication despite apparent biological limitations. I compared you to Concordat species that evolved in stable environments, and by those standards, human biology appeared inefficient and fragile." She paused, choosing her words carefully, aware that this conversation would likely be documented and reviewed, but more concerned with honoring the truth that the data had revealed. "I was wrong. Not about the details of your biology, but about what those details meant." Marcus remained silent, his expression attentive, and she continued. "Human biology is not inefficient, it's optimized for a different set of parameters than any species the Concordat has previously encountered. Your bodies are not designed for optimal performance in stable conditions but for survival and function across a range of conditions that most species would consider incompatible with life. The cardiovascular system I mocked for its failure rates is actually an adaptive performance engine that allows you to operate at varying levels of intensity that would destroy less flexible biological pumps. The immune system I called reactive is actually a learning system that builds specific defenses against novel threats in real time. The neurological architecture I dismissed as adequate is actually a sophisticated parallel processing system that allows you to function under cognitive loads that would overwhelm most species' decision-making capacity." She pulled up the comparative stress response data, showing him the graphs that had taken her days to fully comprehend. "When I subjected you to the stress protocols, I interpreted your biological responses as panic reactions, the thrashing of an inferior organism. I was catastrophically wrong. Your body was activating what I now understand is a species-wide performance enhancement system, temporarily optimizing every major biological function for crisis response. Your heart rate increased not from fear but to supply enhanced oxygen to muscles and brain. Your sensory processing sharpened to detect threats and opportunities. Your pain sensitivity decreased to prevent injury signals from interfering with necessary action. Your cognitive function shifted to prioritize rapid decision-making over extended analysis. In short, Commander, your biology transformed you into an enhanced version of yourself in direct response to perceived danger. Marcus's expression had shifted during her explanation, the careful neutrality replaced by something she was learning to recognize as pride, not the arrogant superiority she displayed but a quieter satisfaction at being truly seen. The Concordat databases classify humans as Category 7, marginally suitable for military service and requiring extensive support systems to operate in standard Concordat environments, she continued, her skin flushing with chromatic patterns that indicated deep embarrassment in her species. Based on the comprehensive analysis of your biology and the historical performance data I've reviewed from human military personnel across the Concordat, I am recommending a complete reclassification. She pulled up her formal report, the document that had taken her the last 12 hours to write, revising and refining as she tried to capture in clinical language what the data revealed. Humans should be classified as a Category 2 species, exceptional resilience and adaptability, with biological systems optimized for high-stress environments and crisis response. Your species exhibits performance enhancement under adverse conditions that exceeds baseline function, a trait previously observed only in the Kryn warrior caste and the Volturi, both of whom evolved on worlds the Concordat classifies as death worlds. She paused, meeting his eyes with all four of her own. Earth, Commander Webb, is apparently also a death world by Concordat standards, though the initial survey teams failed to recognize this because they measured habitability by Concordat norms rather than by the standards of the species that evolved there. What does this mean practically? Marcus asked, his voice steady but carrying an emotional undertone that her sensors detected as carefully controlled excitement. It means that the Concordat has been dramatically underutilizing human personnel, Velcara replied. It means that the medical protocols we've been applying to your species are inadequate and potentially counterproductive, designed for species that need support to function under stress rather than species that perform optimally under stress. It means that human combat performance that we've been attributing to cultural factors or tactical innovation is actually supported by biological capabilities that we failed to recognize. She gestured at the comprehensive data still floating between them. It means, Commander, that when the Concordat accepted humanity as a member species, we thought we were gaining another Category 7 civilization, useful for their technology and their numbers but requiring protection and support. We were wrong. We gained something far more valuable and far more dangerous, a species that evolution designed to survive and thrive under conditions that most of the Concordat considers impossible. Velcara deactivated the displays, leaving just the two of them in the dimmed laboratory, and she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability that her training suggested was unprofessional but which her instincts told her was necessary. I laughed at your biology, Commander. I mocked the inefficiencies and the apparent design flaws. I did this because I didn't understand that those features were the price of capabilities that my species, that most Concordat species, simply don't possess. We evolved in stable environments where optimization for specific conditions was rewarded. You evolved in chaos where adaptability and resilience were the only paths to survival. Neither approach is superior in absolute terms, but they produce very different results. Marcus stood, extending his hand in the human gesture of respect and agreement, and she reached out with one of her appendages to clasp it, feeling the warmth of his skin, the controlled strength in his grip, understanding now that even this simple gesture was supported by sophisticated neurological and muscular systems that allowed humans to modulate force with precision. Thank you, Doctor, he said simply. For looking past your assumptions. For seeing what the data actually showed. It's what any good scientist should do, she replied, though I'm ashamed it took me so long to set aside my prejudices. She released his hand, her skin cycling through colors that indicated deep respect in her species' emotional vocabulary. Your results will be forwarded to Concordat Medical Command along with my recommendations for revised protocols for human personnel. I suspect this will initiate a comprehensive review of human biological classification. The implications are significant. After Marcus left, Valkera stood alone in her laboratory, surrounded by the data that had appended her understanding of xenobiology, and she thought about the future that this knowledge implied. The Concordat had existed for thousands of years, a stable civilization of species that had learned to cooperate and coexist, but always with the understanding that they represented the pinnacle of evolutionary achievement in the galaxy. Now humanity had arrived, bringing with them biology that suggested evolution could take very different paths, that optimization for stability was only one strategy among many, and that the chaotic, dangerous environments the Concordat avoided might produce capabilities that stable worlds never could. She didn't know whether to be excited or terrified by the implications, so she allowed herself to feel both, knowing that the galaxy had just become far more interesting and far less predictable than the Concordat's careful categorizations had suggested. And somewhere in the depths of her being, in the part of her consciousness that her species associated with intuition and instinct, she felt something that the data couldn't quite capture but which her emotional sensors recognized as wonder. The profound realization that the universe was larger, stranger, and more full of possibility than even her 3 centuries of experience had taught her to expect.